before sunrise on a mild summer morning in June 1995. A 27-year-old television news anchor named Jodi Huisentruit hurriedly left her apartment in Mason City, Iowa, headed for work. But she never arrived, and her disappearance has never been solved. In 2003, two television news reporters created FindJodi.com, a website dedicated to preserving Jodi's memory and keeping her case alive. This is the official FindJodi Podcast. Welcome back to the FindJodi Podcast. I'm Scott Fuller. When people talk about Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance in 1995 and it being solved, quote unquote, what does that really mean? Friends and family of Jodi and the general public at this point, they say they'd like to see Jodi's case solved from a standpoint of resolution, of having some answers to what happened to Jodi 26 years ago. But from a practical standpoint, solving Jodi's case means prosecuting whoever took Jodi and presumably killed Jodi. And to prosecute Jodi's case, especially at this point, so many years later, isn't just a matter of figuring out who did it, but prosecuting that person. This is where law enforcement practicalities and legal standards come into play. To this point, Jodi Huisentruit's remains have never been located, and so to solve Jodi's case would mean to prosecute a no-body homicide, put somebody on trial and convict them without the benefit of a body as evidence in the case. So for the purposes of examining that practicality, what solving Jodi's case would really mean today, Caroline Lowe recently interviewed Tad DiBiase. Tad DiBiase was a federal homicide prosecutor for 12-plus years. He has consulted or personally investigated on hundreds of murder cases. One of his specialties is no-body homicides. On this episode of the podcast, Tad DiBiase discusses no-body cases in general, why they're so difficult to get to trial, and specifically the challenges that law enforcement and prosecutors might face in the Jodi Huisentruit case. That's coming up next.
Tad, can you tell us a little bit about your background? We have your book called No-Body Homicide Cases, which goes to the kind of work you've been doing. Can you tell us a little bit about your background as a federal prosecutor working on no-body cases?
Sure. So I was a prosecutor for just over 12 years as an assistant U.S. attorney in D.C., and D.C. is unique because the District of Columbia does not have a district attorney like most locations, and so the federal prosecutors in D.C. prosecute both your kind of standard federal crimes, public corruption, large-scale narcotics cases, white-collar crime, those types of things. But there's also a very large section that prosecutes local crimes, everything from simple assaults and shoplifting all the way up to homicide. So it's the only U.S. Attorney's Office in the country that acts as a local prosecutor as well as a federal prosecutor, which is why it's the largest prosecutor's office in the country. And when I joined the office, I was always very interested in becoming a homicide prosecutor. So after about 3 years in the office, I was transferred into a homicide section. And although I went to different sections in the office and became a supervisor several times, most of my career was on homicides and trying homicide cases. And in about 2004, I was given a case by a colleague of mine that was actually at the time a missing persons case, and we all believed that was actually a no-body murder case, which is what it turned out to be. So I started investigating this case with the lead detective, and we worked very closely together. And after doing that case and successfully getting a conviction in that case, in what was then only the second no-body murder trial in the history of the District of Columbia, which is a little surprising because D.C. then and now has a very high murder rate, but there had only been one other no-body murder case that had ever gone to trial in D.C. I became very fascinated with this area of homicide prosecution, so I started researching cases and trying to find more cases and tried to count how many cases there were, across the country. And it really grew into really this sort of what I call more than a hobby, not quite a job, maybe an obsession is the better word for it, this fascination with no-body murder cases and collecting the information about how many cases there are and how these cases can be put together and can be investigated, prosecuted, and successfully tried. And so that's really what sort of piqued my interest was my own case. And from there, I've gone on to consult now across the country on probably about 40 no-body homicide cases. And then I also teach classes to police and prosecutors about how to investigate and try these cases, as well as also, speaking to reporters, lecturing on the cases. And then I also wrote a book that came out in 2014 that is kind of a practical guide to how to investigate, prosecute, and win these cases.
Just how tough is it to get a conviction without a body? How key is a body to investigating and solving a case?
Well, the body, if you think about it, is really the key to a homicide case because the body typically tells you how a murder happened. Was the person shot? Were they stabbed? Were they strangled? Were they poisoned? The body tells you where the murder happened. If you find the body indoors in a pool of blood, it's likely that's where the murder actually happened. If you find it outdoors, you can get some indication from seeing the scene as to what happened there. And even if it didn't happen there, the fact that a body was dumped somewhere also gives you some information. The body also tells you when the murder happened. There's a big difference between a body that was killed an hour ago and one that was killed 6 years ago. And science has reached a point where it can be pretty good at estimating what's called time of death or interval of death when you have the body. When you don't have the body, you don't have any of that very basic information. How was this person killed? Where was this person killed? When was this person killed? And I've likened it to, it's like a 100-meter race where the murderer starts at about the 60-meter mark and has that much of an advantage. And even if you're Usain Bolt trying to chase down someone who has a 60-meter advantage in a 100-meter race is going to win every time, no matter who is running after them. It's a huge advantage to have secreted the body and to not have the ability as a detective or a prosecutor to be able to have that body. That's what makes the investigating and the prosecuting of those cases so difficult because you start off with such a significant handicap as compared to a regular run-of-the-mill murder case. In a normal murder case, the only question is, did that guy sitting over there in the defendant's chair kill this person? In a no-body murder case, the first question you have to answer as the police and the prosecutor is, was there even a murder? Because one of the most common defenses in a no-body murder case, of course, is we don't even know if she's dead, right? We don't know where she is. And that's the first challenge that you have to overcome. And then once you've maybe proven beyond a reasonable doubt and proven to the jury that, yes, there was a murder, then you're already back at what's normally the only step at a regular murder case, which is, did that guy who's sitting over there in the defendant's chair, is he the one who did it?
Do you run into that with jurors in the potential jury pool are willing to accept a case, consider a case without a body? Is that something you have to identify?
Yes, absolutely, Caroline. That's a really important thing that I train on when talking to police and particularly prosecutors is that you must eliminate anyone from the jury pool who thinks, even if the government proves its case beyond a reasonable doubt, I'm not going to find the defendant guilty of murder because the government doesn't have a body. You cannot have that person on your jury. And if it's determined that that's how that person thinks, the judge has to eliminate that person because it is basic law that if the government proves its case beyond a reasonable doubt, a juror must find the person guilty. And so there's usually a question that I tell prosecutors that either they ask if they do the voir dire, which is a questioning of prospective jurors themselves. They either ask it or get the judge to ask it, which is that very question. The government proves its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Even though they haven't presented you with a body, can you still find the defendant guilty? The answer has to be yes, or they cannot be on the jury.
Can you describe the key kind of evidence that actually helps investigation of a no-body case, what are some of the kind of things, particularly an older case, what are the things you look for that can help you solve it, minus the body? What kind of evidence do you look for that could be helpful?
So typically in a no-body case, you find what I call three quantums of evidence, or the three legs of the stool. And in your best case, you're going to have all three of these legs. In the case that I tried, that case had all three of these quantums of evidence. Leg number one is forensic evidence, and it can be DNA, it can be hair, it can be fingerprints, it can be a type of non-biological forensic evidence such as cell tower information or cell phone records, but some type of indisputable evidence that the prosecution can point to and say, this evidence says this, and everybody agrees that it says that. That's kind of the gold standard of what you want to get in a no-body murder case, and is very common in a no-body murder case. The next leg of a stool is what I call confession to friends and family, where the defendant has said to someone else, hey, I did it, or they've described it, or they've given enough damning information. And that friends and family can be a jailhouse informant, it can be a friend, it can be an ex-lover, current lover, any one of those types of people who then go and tell the police, hey, this is what the defendant said to me. And then the last leg of the stool is confession to the police, because you do still, despite you sort of think, why would anyone confess to the police? That's the last person you'd want to tell. People do have guilty consciences. People do want to get it off their chest. And so there often are these confessions to the police. In a strong no-body murder case, like I said, you have all three of these. In a weak case, you don't have any of them. And there are cases that are made with none of those, but those are very few, and far between. And then you ask specifically about in a colder case. Well, in thinking about, these quantums of evidence, in a colder case, of course, it's going to be much harder to find the body. And one thing I counsel police and prosecutors when I talk to them is, look, I, have spent the last probably close to 15 years lecturing about how to try a no-body murder case. But don't get me wrong, it's always better to have the body. So if you can look for and find the body, you're always going to be better off. But in a case, like Jodi's case now, 26 years later, you're not likely to find the body. I don't care what atmosphere you're in. Maybe if you're in, the North Pole, there's a chance. But because of where this murder happened, it is highly unlikely they're going to find, any evidence of a body, particularly if the body was disposed of out of doors in a body of water or buried or abandoned somewhere, in the middle of the woods. It's highly unlikely. So that means as police investigate the case, what I would counsel them is you don't want to spend a lot of time looking for the body. It's just not going to be a good use of your time. If it was 1 year out, 2 years out, 5 years out, the advice would be very different. But here then, you need to focus on what are the other two legs of the stool: confession to friends and family, confession to police, and then any forensic evidence that does not rely on finding a body. Now, unfortunately, back in 1995, cell phones and those types of things were very, very new. So they're just not something that, we saw very often. But there still may be other forensic style evidence that may exist out there that doesn't rely on biological evidence.
Well, and unfortunately, in Jodi's case, police have told us from the beginning that there was very little physical evidence. There was one hair found at the scene. We don't know if it has a root. We're told there's a palm print that may or may not be connected. It could have been Jodi's. A number of her friends have touched the car, and there's no blood evidence. So something like that, what would you rely on if not likely to have good physical evidence? Or do you still think there might be some good physical evidence that's developed over the years? I mean, it's hard to imagine how that would develop if you didn't have that at the beginning.
Yeah, and I think that's true. And obviously, I don't know, what the police have. I only know from, like you, what I have read. But it would seem to me that the focus in this case really should not be on physical evidence. It really has to be on cases that are older, tend to come out when someone tells someone something else. That's really what the focus needs to be. And when you're dealing with a no-body murder case, you really have kind of two circles that you have to look around. You have to look around the victim. Who is around in her circle? Who does she know? I liken it to when you throw a stone or a rock in a body of water, the concentric circles, come out. The further away you get from the person, the less the the circles are, but you have to go out pretty far. You know, when you throw a rock in, it really sends out rings that are pretty far and are pretty discernible pretty far. So number one, you have to go through the rings of the victim, and two, you have to go through the rings of anyone who is a potential suspect. And it's really important because what I have found is in no-body murder cases, people often spend a lot of time looking at the victim and who knew the victim and who was close to the victim and all of that, which is important, but it's also important to make sure you have covered all of your suspects and what rings are around them as well.
So it could be someone in the outer circle of somebody you've looked at that might have information, or might...
Absolutely, because now, 26 years later, maybe I was friends with a suspect, but now I'm not. Maybe I dated the suspect in 1995, but I don't anymore. Maybe I was married to someone in 1995, but I'm not anymore, and that person's locked up. So ironically, sometimes in any cold case, not just no-body murders, time works in your factor because people who absolutely wouldn't have told you anything in 1995 are more likely to tell you things now because time has passed. As people age, they hopefully mature and receive more wisdom and judgment and understanding about themselves and how the world works. Sometimes you find that the passage of time is actually a benefit because you find people who didn't want to talk are now more willing to talk and discuss things they didn't want to talk about 26 years ago.
Relationships changed for a lot of people over the years.
Absolutely, they do, really, for all of us, right? I mean, even our relationships with loved ones change over time. Hopefully, you know, for family and things like that, they can grow closer, but that's not always true for everyone. Sometimes even close familial relationships, you grow apart and you start to see that person in a different light. If you knew someone who murdered someone, but you were dating them or married to them, you might look at them differently 20 year later when you're no longer married to them and you think, God, what was I thinking? This person's a monster. And I know what they did. Then sometimes you find out, you know, that person does know something. And that's why it's really important for people to understand that the police are still looking at this case and they haven't given up.
There have been two federal grand juries 20 years apart that looked into Jodi's case. One was in 1997, 2 years after she was abducted. The most recent in 2017. They have focused from what we, as you know, grand jury cases are secret, but what we understand is that there were no indictments ever handed down. The first one, we were told that a woman who claimed she was out walking with the main person of interest, she had talked to the person of interest 90 minutes after Jodi disappeared. She was out walking with him an hour later. She was called in for 5 hours to testify. She's the only person we're aware of. Then just in 2017, there was another federal grand jury, the same person authorities have been looking at. In this case, they subpoenaed him to come back from Arizona, where he lives now, to Iowa to provide palm print, DNA swab, fingerprints, even though he'd provided prints in the past. From your perspective as a federal prosecutor, and again, we're not D.C. where you do the primary prosecutions of cases, we're talking Iowa, why would two federal grand juries be called in the case from anything you've dealt with, and just your thoughts on that?
Well, first, my assumption is that they believe they have a federal hook with a kidnapping charge, which is a federal offense. And, you know, state grand juries have different ways that they are used. Some states in D.C., even though it's not a state, the way we used our local grand juries was very much as an investigative grand jury. It was locking in testimony, getting information that people couldn't change at trial, or if it was changed at trial, as a prosecutor, you could make the person to look very bad at trial for having changed something that they told the grand jury in secret, and now we're being forced to testify openly. So my sense is because they have this federal grand juries work the same way that we did in D.C., because in D.C. we had local grand juries and federal grand juries, and I suspect the thought is let's lock in testimony, let's get information that we can and lock it in so that if we ever do go to trial, we have the ability to have that locked in. I don't know enough about Iowa grand juries and how that might work at a state level. It may be they could also do it at a state level, but the thought is let's just keep it federal because kidnapping is a federal crime. It does appear from everything, the limited information we have, that it does appear to be that she was abducted, taken against her will. So that to me would seem like that's the federal hook.
How unusual is it in your experience to have two separate federal grand juries, as I said, 2 decades apart, the same case? Have you run into that? Any insight in that?
I would definitely say that's unusual. First of all, because federal no-body murder cases are fairly rare because federally murders aren't usually prosecuted by the federal government. So that in and of itself is fairly rare. And then to have grand juries that far apart, I think is not unheard of, but is definitely rare. I mean, that's a long time to go, and seemingly not really that much different, information. But again, you always have to caution that we don't have all the information that the police and the prosecutors have. And I'm always hopeful that police and prosecutors have more information than we have. But at the end of the day, even though it is a very low threshold to indict someone, it is basically probable cause, which is, you can't even put a percentage on it. It's maybe 33% or something like that. Prosecutors at the federal level, which is what I was guided by, cannot move forward with a case unless they have a greater than 50% chance of proving the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So that is a significantly higher threshold than it might be to simply indict someone. They have to be able to assure, probably in a case of this notoriety all the way up the chain of the Department of Justice to, potentially the Attorney General, they have to be able to say, yes, we have enough evidence that we can prove this at 50 plus 0.1% beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's a tough standard. What you find in most no-body murder cases is the challenge is getting it to trial. Once you're at trial, the conviction rate is actually significantly higher than a regular murder case. A regular murder case, the conviction rate runs about 70%. At a no-body murder case, it's about 87%, which may seem counterintuitive because you think, well, I thought you said these cases are hard, and yet 87% of them end up in convictions. And that's because in a missing persons case, only the strongest cases are going to be taken to trial. There are hundreds of thousands of missing persons cases that never go to trial that are likely homicide cases. But because the defense is so obvious, that is, was this person even murdered? We don't even know that. A prosecutor's only going to take a really, really strong case when there's no body to trial.
And strong case having the kind of evidence you talked about earlier, forensic, electronic, maybe a confession, those kind of three-legged things.
Yeah, I'll give you the example. In my career, I tried 20 homicide cases, one of which was the no-body case, and it was by far the strongest murder case I had. I mean, it was kind of ridiculously strong because we had a confession to the police. We had a confession to friends and family. We had real decent forensic evidence. We had what we called ear witnesses. That is not witnesses who saw things, but witnesses who heard things in the house the night it happened. So we had a very good timeline of almost down to the exact day. We had kind of 2 days. We weren't sure on which day it happened, but it was around Thanksgiving, and we had children witnesses. We had 5 children witnesses in the house, all of whom overheard at least something that was damning, and a few of them saw something that was damning, not a murder, but saw the defendant with a murder weapon. That, to me, is a really, really strong case, whereas most of my other cases did not have all of that quantum of evidence.
Also in March 2017, when the second federal grand jury convened, the Mason City Police subpoenaed GPS data for 2 vehicles connected to the main person that they've been focusing on since almost from the beginning. The police chief later said that they didn't come up with anything. They have continued each year to renew keeping the probable cause of all of the stuff sealed in court. Just wonder what your take on something like that, and would you keep it sealed, or would it be something, if it didn't produce evidence, why not share that with the public? What was their probable cause? What was their case for going after the data that they did not obtain?
What I would say is I can see a reason for keeping it sealed because there is probably information that they have to put in their probable cause warrant in order to get that warrant signed off by a prosecutor and then by a judge. That is probably something that maybe only the murderer knows. And I can see why you might be convinced as an investigative advantage not to release that to the public, because once that's out, if someone were to come forward and confess, or someone were to come forward and say, hey, Tad confessed to me that he did X, Y, and Z, and this is what he did to Jodi, and this is where he put her and all that, and they have information that corroborates that witness, that is a very powerful piece of evidence. It would seem to me it's not illogical to keep it sealed. Now, in this day and age of kind of citizen detectives, both good and bad, that can also cause problems because you're not letting out all of the evidence that may actually be to the advantage of the police and the prosecutors, because you're kind of using a force multiplier of all these people trying to solve it. So there's pluses and minuses to it. I would have to hope that they did that weighing of the pluses and the minuses and determined, we got to keep it sealed because there is some information there that is significant enough that we don't want it to come out in public.
And would that information point in the direction, in your experience, toward the person who they're looking, whose GPS data they're seeking, versus just facts about the case?
Oh, it would have to point specifically to the GPS person, because in order to put a GPS on a person, you have to have specific information that leads you to say, I have probable cause to believe this person did something. It would definitely have to be connected to that person.
Does it seem unusual to have the grand juries so far apart? One back in, it said 20 years earlier, and then what would prompt another one 20 years later?
Generally a couple of things. One could be new evidence. They could have found something and decided, this is enough to open up the case again. A second reason could be one of the benefits of a grand jury is, as I mentioned earlier, is you are locking in testimony, you are locking in information, and having a grand jury gives you the ability to subpoena new information. So it could simply be that they decided, this person was spoken to 17 years ago, but we didn't lock them in the grand jury. We didn't get the information. Maybe they're getting elderly. We'd like to lock that information in while they can still, they're of sound mind and body. And so they may just feel it is important to go ahead and get that information before they don't have the ability to get it anymore.
As you look at it from the outside, and I know you've just read what's in the public arena about the Jodi case, any general impressions about how tough a case like this would be to move forward in terms of prosecution?
I will say, I think, if I do a lot of consulting, and when I consult, I get the police file and I look at it. If this were the only police file, which I suspect it's not. I suspect there's more information that the public does not know about. But if this were the police file, I would say you all have a tough case. You're gonna need something more, which means you're gonna have to redouble efforts to interview people who knew her back then, to interview people who knew the suspect back then, or suspects, whoever people you might think are possibilities. You're really going to have to redouble those efforts because, like I said very early on, the way you're going to make this case is somebody is going to tell you something. That is my looking at the evidence now. That is the best way, the most likely way to proceed. It doesn't mean you don't get a Hail Mary and suddenly we find her body, which would be fantastic. But you have to play the percentages, and the percentages in this case are you're going to find out because someone's going to tell you something. It is, I think, pretty rare that people don't talk about it or never say anything in cases that end up being successfully prosecuted. There are obviously hundreds of thousands of cases where people are missing and people didn't say anything. But if you're going to be one of the ones who solves the case, you're going to want to increase your chances by talking to people, knowing people that the police are still looking at the case. They haven't forgotten about it, and trying to figure it out. There's an additional complication here, I think, that makes this case a little bit different than a lot of cases, and that is that she was somewhat, I assume, a high profile or at least a known person in the community because she was a TV reporter and she was an attractive, young woman. That unfortunately kind of enlarges your suspect pool because with most people, they're not well known and there's a small circle of people who know them, love them, hate them, want them dead. And when you have someone who might be a, somewhat minor celebrity and is certainly in a profession that unfortunately, as I'm sure you know, can attract stalkers and weirdos and people who get fixations on people who, I see them on TV, particularly someone who's, a young, attractive person. it unfortunately, I think, increases your suspect pool pretty significantly.
You mentioned in your writings how important it is not to just be presumably locked into one person. Can you address that in terms of multiple layers or multiple people to look at?
Absolutely. It's really important. I mean, most no-body murder cases are domestic cases. That is, it's a husband killing a wife, boyfriend killing girlfriend, husband killing ex-wife, all of those permutations, parent killing child. Those are about 52% of all no-body murder cases. And in those cases, the suspects are often very obvious. If a child is missing, absent any indications they were kidnapped by a stranger, which is exceedingly rare, but that doesn't mean in your specific case that that's what happened. And that's what I often teach on, is you cannot have blinders on. What happens as a practical matter, you may not only miss the true suspect, which is bad, but more practically, even if you have the right suspect, ultimately, if you haven't eliminated other people, when you go to trial, a skillful defense attorney is going to be able to say, well, didn't you get a tip that this person was involved in it? What did you do to eliminate that person? Well, I didn't do anything because I knew my person was this person right here. Well, that's going to be a problem for you at trial. It is very important that you eliminate even people you think may not be likely suspects or may be likely suspects but aren't the person you think did it. You still have to eliminate those people. And by the same token, you have to make an honest effort to say, is this someone who could have done it? There are certainly many cases out there where the suspect was the husband or the suspect was a boyfriend, and it turned out it wasn't that person. It was a stranger or someone else. And there have been cases where a child has gone missing and never to be found, and the father falsely confessed to doing it himself because he was so distraught over it. And then the true, person who did the murder was discovered, was prosecuted, and ultimately led the police to that person's to the child's body. So we knew for sure it was this person. It wasn't the father. So you really, as a detective, cannot have blinders, and you really have to go into it with an open mind, even if you certainly can focus on who your suspects might be. If I have a dead wife, I'm not going to say, well, the husband's just the same as everybody else out there. No, your husband's going to be your main suspect to start, and then you're going to see, can I eliminate this person? And there are other people out there at the same time.
How do you get involved in a case? Do you work with families? Do you go directly to the police? Can you kind of walk us through the process? And I understand you do this, you're consulting for free, is that correct?
I do consult for free, and the way I typically am involved, and the only way I will get involved is if I'm requested to by the police. So the most common way is the police reach out directly to me and ask me to be involved. The second most common way is a family will reach out to me, ask if I'm interested. 99% of the time I tell them, yes, I'm interested in helping. But then I tell them, you have to contact the police and the police have to contact me. I'm not comfortable contacting the police out of the blue because I find police aren't generally receptive to that. And if I was a police officer, I'd be like, well, who's this guy? I don't know who this guy is calling me, asking me to help. And so I tell the family that once the police agree to have my assistance, I typically need the entire file. I need complete cooperation. I have very, very rarely worked on cases where I don't get the entire police file. I have to have the entire thing. I have to have the full cooperation. And I've done 40 plus cases, and I've always had full cooperation with a minor few exceptions where I agreed to just kind of help on more of a limited basis. But I also tell the family that once I agree to work with the police, I will not speak to them again, that it is not appropriate for me to speak to them, that all of my conversations will be with the police, and that even if the police never make an arrest or it never, goes any further, I still won't speak to the family after that. That I believe it's very important for the police to understand. I just speak to them once I'm on the case, and I don't have any allegiance or tie to the family, and I make sure families are very aware of that. It's not to be mean or uncaring, but I have to make sure that the police fully understand that I don't leak, I don't talk to the press, I don't talk to the family about the case, and I will not. I've often had podcasters and the press call and ask about cases that I've worked on where they haven't known that I've worked on them, and I tell them right away, as long as I can go off the record, I'll tell you why I can't speak to you about the case, but you have to agree not to put that in the story, and then I'll tell them I actually consulted on this case, so I can't talk to you about it.
And in terms of our role at FindJodi, we're kind of like a clearinghouse for a lot of information. We direct people to the police, but as you may know, many people don't want to go directly, so they'll come to us. We put up billboards, and one of them said, "Someone knows something. Is it you?" The most recent one we have in Mason City said, "Don't sit in silence." And basically, time to talk is now. We have a podcast. Any other suggestions as sort of citizen journalists, detectives you would have for us, things to help the case and things to avoid in our role at FindJodi?
No, you're absolutely doing the right thing. I mean, that is so important to keep her name out there. I mean, it is literally one of the highest profile missing person cases. I mean, there are a lot of cases out there. There are, not a ton of cases that even people who aren't in this world know about, and that is certainly one of one. When you first contacted me and said, I'm interested in talking about Jodi's case, I, of course, knew exactly who it was. And that is very important. Any type of social media, obviously podcasts are a super popular format now. True crime in particular is a very popular format. The one thing I always caution people about is I do think it's really important to be very circumspect about putting people's names out there, putting people out there as suspects, being very diligent about maintaining some control over comments and things like that, because there have been certainly very bad examples. The Boston Marathon bombing being the best example of sort of incredibly bad information getting out there and harming people. And I do think it's very important that podcasters need to have some level of responsibility about who they talk about and what they say and all that, and making sure that citizen detectives aren't going off on, crazy wild goose chases and putting a bunch of crazy information out there. But from everything I've seen from what you all have done and the information, it's been very responsibly done. And obviously you have a deep journalism background. And I think that makes a big difference too. You certainly know what libel and slander are as compared to most people. And
over the years, things have gotten increasingly close and tighter in the vest with the police department. They're releasing less these days than before. Do you think at this point more should be released? And one of the things that comes up from time to time, there was a video, an 18, 20-minute video of Jodi's birthday party. It was thrown a couple of weeks before she disappeared. Some of the video showed up on a crime show, a network show a couple of years ago. Police have consistently refused to release that. Would you see any value in releasing that kind of video that shows Jodi, the people at the party, people at the bar, or do you see that as something that they should continue to keep close to the vest?
I think it's hard to say in a vacuum, and I tend to say, to police in situations like this, if you have something in there that you think is going to be something that only the murderer knows, then you certainly want to keep 1, 2, 3 of those in your pocket, because it's very important as corroboration. That said, in this day and age, I do think it's important for police to use the public as a valuable asset. If there is, information, and it certainly would seem to me that a video of a birthday party before she went missing, obviously, that potentially could provide some important clues. Maybe they're not able to identify everybody in that video. Maybe they are, which is great, but maybe they're not. And if they're able to play that, it certainly increases the chances of people saying, oh, well, that's Doug and that's Johnny and blah, blah, blah. So in this day and age, if done right, I do think there is a lot of, ability to do that. Look, in the January 6th cases in the United States Capitol, you have the FBI releasing almost weekly photos of people and videos of people, and you have these websites where they call them January 6 hunters or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's almost like Nazi hunters of old. But they are people who are looking for these people, and they do a great job of finding it. And I do think the world is different now than it was in 1995 because of the internet, and you have to use that to your advantage. Unless you have a good reason to say, I don't want to show this because it's gonna mess up this aspect of the case. I get that, But I'd be hard-pressed to see how a birthday party, 18 to 19-minute video of a birthday party, is going to contain 19 minutes worth of evidence that only the murderer knows. It would seem to me there's probably portions of it at the very least you could release.
And could releasing some of it perhaps help identify someone who might be at the bar, someone who's at the scene that maybe has not been identified before?
Absolutely. A birthday party at a bar that's also open to the public, it does seem unlikely that they would know everybody in that video. And it does seem more likely that that's maybe the way to kind of use, crowdsourcing, if handled skillfully, is a way to do it. There's a journalist, Billy Jensen, who's written a book on this, who does it very skillfully in the way he uses video clips and things like that to engender people looking at it and saying, hey, I do know something about that. He releases it through Facebook in the area where the event happened, which is, you can do that. You can figure out by who has Facebook pages in this area. So, obviously me sitting in D.C., I'm not going to know anything about a party that happened in Iowa in 1995. But if I still live in Iowa all these years later, and I look at that and I'll say, oh my God, I do know about that because my brother went to that party, my sister went to that party. And those, I think, are the types of things that can be very valuable in a case like this.
And Billy Jensen and Paul Holes just featured Jodi's case a few weeks ago on their Murder Squad, and I have his book.
I did not. I'll have to listen to that. I have finally finished listening to My Favorite Murder, and I need to start picking up another podcast. So I'm going to start listening to Finding Jodi, but I started thinking about I really should listen to Murder Squad as well, because I'm a big admirer of both Jensen and Holes.
And we learn a lot from them too. We try to look at other cases, and looking at your book, you try to get some ideas of things that were resolved, that got answers. Anything, how can people reach you, get your book, connect to your website? Can you share some of that with us?
Sure. So absolutely. So the best way to reach me is through my email. It's just tad.dibiase@gmail.com, and the last name is spelled D-I-B-I-A-S-E. And if you go to my website, which is nobodymurdercases.com, it has my telephone number on there, my cell phone number, and then I have a pretty active Twitter feed called The Nobody Guy on Twitter. Those are really, any one of those ways are probably the best way to reach out to me if you want to talk about a case that you have, a case you're interested in. What I would say is a couple things which I always say to family members, which is never give up. It is really important in these cases to understand that it can go on for a long time. I just spoke to someone who told me about a case that I think it's 45 years in between missing and now going to trial, and that's the record. And here it is very important to keep Jodi's case, alive and keep it in the public domain. And that's the type of thing that I believe, will ultimately lead to, a break in the case.
FindJodi is a nonprofit run by volunteers with a mission of keeping Jodi's unsolved case in the spotlight. Anyone with information about Jodi's case can reach out to the Mason City Police Department. Information can also be provided to the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigations. You can also contact FindJodi anonymously if you prefer. Don't sit in silence. The time to talk is now. For the entire FindJodi team, I'm Scott Fuller. Thank you for listening.